Hello everyone, I am the Whisperer, and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video, and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. The familiar click of the kettle used to soothe me, yet now, when I press the switch, the water within refuses to warm. It's a peculiar stillness, this silence from the small electric appliance on my kitchen counter, a stubborn defiance that feels subtly at odds with the quiet hum of my city apartment, a familiar rhythm that usually anchors me to the predictable comforts of dawn. The scent of unbrewed tea, of dry, fragrant leaves still sealed within their caddy, hangs in the air, a phantom promise of warmth and waking. The sunlight, a pale, hesitant sliver, begins its slow climb above the distant rooftops, casting long, sleepy shadows across the polished floorboards, illuminating the kettle's inert form with an almost theatrical spotlight. My apartment, a sanctuary of routines and quiet echoes, holds this particular morning a breath of something deeply unsettling, like finding a reflection that doesn't quite mimic your movements, subtle enough to deceive the casual eye, but profoundly wrong to the one who knows its true form. The quiet hum of the refrigerator in the corner, a gentle backdrop to the awakening day, now seems to resonate with a faint, almost melodic quality, like a distant, off-key lullaby, emphasizing the kettle's silent rebellion. I remember distinctly the crisp, reassuring click of the switch, the soft, immediate rumble of the heating element, the slow, building murmur of water preparing for its transformation. It was a small thing, a mundane sound, yet it was a fundamental anchor in the quiet ritual of my mornings. But this morning, as my thumb pressed down on the worn plastic, there was only the soft, yielding resistance of the switch, and then nothing. No click, no rumble, no whisper of awakening water. The kettle stood there, stoic and unmoving, its polished metal surface reflecting the pale kitchen light with an almost defiant gleam. My fingers, curled around the base of the handle, felt its cool, inanimate weight, undeniable. Yet the absence of any response, any subtle tremor of internal life, left a tiny prickle, like a shard of ice, on the back of my mind. It was a sensation of wrongness, too precise, too fleeting to be easily dismissed, a whisper of discord in the quiet symphony of the morning. Wasn't the first time, not truly. There had been smaller things, easily dismissed. A door refusing to close with its usual soft latch. A book slipping from my grasp without warning. But those were explainable, tiny slips in the fabric of everyday interaction, perhaps. This, however, was an active, deliberate act of non-cooperation, executed with a seamless precision I could not account for, and it spoke not of malfunction, but of a subtle, pervasive rejection. The air, usually so still and settled in these early hours, seemed to hold a charge, a subtle vibration that resonated with the unanswered question of that inert kettle. Later that afternoon, as I reached for my favorite teacup from the shelf, the one with the delicate blue floral pattern, my fingers brushed against the cool ceramic, anticipating its familiar weight, its comforting curve. But as I attempted to lift it, a peculiar thing happened. It resisted. Not stubbornly, not with a sudden jarring stop, but with a subtle, almost imperceptible reluctance, as if its very form was momentarily adhering to the shelf, refusing to be dislodged. My hand tightened, my muscles tensed, and with a soft internal sigh, the cup finally yielded, settling into my palm with a sensation that was both familiar and profoundly alien. It felt lighter than usual, almost insubstantial, yet paradoxically it seemed to cling to my skin, a subtle stickiness that was not there before. I held it for a long moment, my thumb tracing the raised pattern of its painted flowers, trying to reconcile the familiar object with this new, unsettling recalcitrance. It was as if the cup itself had momentarily forgotten its purpose, its inherent function as a vessel to be easily lifted, a companion to be held. My heart, a quiet, frantic drum against my ribs, struggled to comprehend this growing sense of profound, subtle opposition from the objects of my daily life. It was as if the very essence of convenience, the unique ease that defined my interactions with the mundane, was being quietly, meticulously re-edited, smoothed into a more challenging, yet ultimately empty version of itself. The distant hum of the city, usually a soothing backdrop, seemed to take on a faint, almost melodic quality, like a distant off-key lullaby, echoing the unsettling harmony of this silent defiance. The days began to bleed into a strange, dreamlike continuity, each morning bringing a new, quiet alteration to the willing cooperation of my belongings. It was never a grand rebellion, never anything overtly alarming. Always subtle, always intelligent, always slightly unwilling, slightly more perfectly resistant than true inanimate objects should be. The light switch by the bathroom door, which had always responded with a crisp, immediate click, would now occasionally offer a soft, yielding resistance, its mechanism momentarily seeming to seize before reluctantly engaging, the light flickering on with a faint, hesitant glow. My favorite reading lamp, its familiar brass pull chain usually offering a satisfying snap, but now would sometimes refuse to respond to my tug, the chain slipping loosely through my fingers, only to illuminate with a soft, silent pop moments later, as if it had decided to comply on its own terms. Even the simple act of opening a drawer, the familiar glide of wood on wood, would now sometimes be met with a subtle friction, a phantom stickiness that defied the well-oiled runners, before yielding with a slow, almost resentful sigh. Each instance was a soft, almost affectionate correction, an invisible hand smoothing over the rough edges of convenience, rendering my interactions with the mundane slightly more cumbersome, slightly more alien, yet utterly devoid of any discernible reason. The air in the apartment, once crisp and sharp, seemed to grow softer, thicker, laden with an unspoken presence that moved through the familiar spaces of my home with an unhurried grace, settling into the quiet crevices of my daily life, absorbing the very ease of my existence. My sleep became a fragile thing, punctuated by long stretches of wakefulness in the oppressive quiet of the apartment. I would lie there, listening, not for a sound, but for the profound absence of sound, the heavy, waiting stillness that pressed in from all sides, a silence that seemed to hum with unseen resistances. When I turned in bed, the sheets made no rustle, the mattress no faint sigh, as if my body, in its movements, was too light, too insubstantial to elicit a response from the material world. My own limbs seemed to move with a profound silence, a noiseless shift that defied the usual friction of fabric on fabric, skin on linen. It was as if my movements had become too gentle to elicit a response from the material world, too ethereal to create a sound, or perhaps as if the bed itself was politely ignoring my presence. It was a perfected slumber, a breath-by-breath mimicry of ideal sleep. yet it offered no comfort to my waking dread, for the very now felt elusive, filled with a polite, pervasive defiance. The rhythmic ticking of the old grandfather clock in the hallway, its steady pulse a stark counterpoint to the accelerating beat of my own heart, now seemed to possess a deeper, more resonant thrum, as if it were marking not just the passage of time, but the slow, silent unfolding of a profound, unacknowledged rebellion. The moonlight, when it found its way through the single window, seemed to have an unusual density, illuminating the corners of the room with a silver blue light that appeared to cling to the surfaces, revealing nothing, yet somehow highlighting the profound emptiness that had begun to radiate from the very core of inanimate intention. The silence itself felt active, heavy, as if it were holding its breath, waiting for me to succumb to its influence, to fully embrace this perfected, silent void that was slowly becoming my world, a world where objects possessed a quiet, unyielding will. The changes began to touch things more intimate, more deeply personal. My clothes. When I reached for my favorite sweater, the soft wool that always felt like a second skin, my fingers would pass through it for a fleeting instant, a ghost of a touch, before, finally, connecting with the tangible fabric. Then, as I pulled it on, the material would seem to resist, to cling to my skin in unfamiliar ways, its usual comforting drape replaced by a subtle stiffness, as if it were subtly trying to shed my form, to return to an unworn, unused state. The familiar scent of my laundry detergent would be absent, replaced by a faint, almost sterile aroma of clean, unused fabric. It was as if the clothing itself had decided it was not meant for my particular shape, my specific movements, becoming an unwilling skin. This felt like a profound violation of my own physical boundaries, my presence subtly rejected, my individuality questioned by the very garments I chose. The fear was no longer a sudden prickle, but a slow, continuous seep, a cold dread that began to reside in the marrow of my bones, a quiet, insidious companion, as my true self became an increasingly elusive phantom, a ghost in my own skin, my toothbrush. When I picked it up, its familiar plastic handle would sometimes feel subtly alien in my grasp, its weight shifting, its balance subtly off-kilter, as if it were designed for a hand slightly different from my own. The bristles, usually a gentle, familiar caress against my gums, would occasionally feel strangely stiff, almost prickly, as if they were repelling my teeth, refusing their purpose. It was not a physical change in the brush, not a malfunction, but a profound shift in its interaction with me, a subtle resistance to its intended function. It was as if the toothbrush, a tool of such personal intimacy, had decided it was no longer for me, that its purpose lay elsewhere, with another, unseen user. This felt like a profound invasion of my inner sanctuary, my most personal rituals quietly subverted, leaving me with a chilling sense of being unwelcome even in the most mundane acts of self-care. The distant hum of the city, usually a soothing backdrop, seemed to take on a faint, almost melodic quality, like a distant, off-key lullaby, echoing the unsettling disharmony of my rejected tools. The visual representation of objects began to subtly shift. My favorite armchair in the corner of the living room would occasionally appear to possess an imperceptible tension in its velvet fabric, a subtle tautness that belied its usual relaxed form. Its cushions, though smooth to the eye, seemed to hold a faint, almost subliminal resistance to being sat upon, a silent refusal of weight. It was not an overt change in appearance, but a subtle visual cue that hinted at an inner rigidity, a quiet non-compliance. My old wooden desk, its surface worn smooth by years of my hands, would sometimes gleam with an unusual, almost sterile sheen, its familiar scratches and imperfections momentarily absent, as if it had been quietly refinished in defiance of my history with it. It was like catching a fleeting glimpse of a different existence, a parallel world where objects remained untouched, pristine, eternally unused by a specific person. The air around the objects felt cooler too, a distinct pocket of cold that hinted at a profound emptiness, a void where my intended purpose once perfectly resided, a void that was now subtly filled with a quiet, unyielding refusal. I would linger there, my breath held, trying to discern the subtle presence of this defiance, trying to meet the unseen will of these inanimate things. But it would always just elude me, leaving only the familiar, tired forms of my belongings, now imbued with a polite, pervasive unwillingness. The apartment itself began to feel like a perfectly calibrated chamber of quiet rejections. Every object, no matter how small, the porcelain figurine on the mantelpiece, the framed photograph on my desk, the books on my shelves, seemed to hold a subtle, silent resistance to my interaction. When I reached for a book, its spine would feel subtly stiff, its pages clinging together, as if reluctant to be opened by my hands. The figurine, when I tried to adjust it, would feel strangely slippery, almost repelling my touch, its smooth surface resisting my grasp. It was as if the very air had become more sensitive to the unwillingness of my objects, attuned to the quiet non-cooperation, amplifying the void I was creating. I found myself moving with extreme caution, my bare feet sinking into the plush carpet, my hands brushing silently against the smooth surfaces of furniture, terrified of breaking the spell, of shattering the delicate balance of my slow unbelonging. The sunlight, when it entered the rooms, seemed to linger longer, its golden dust-filled shafts illuminating objects with an almost accusing brilliance, revealing the subtle ways in which the space was subtly, gently, erasing my purpose from its very fabric. The sensory input from the world began to subtly diminish, filtered through a growing veil of quiet resistance. The scent of freshly brewed coffee, once so vibrant, now reached me as a faint, almost ghost-like aroma, a distant echo of its former richness, as if the coffee maker itself held back its full fragrance from me. The taste of my morning toast, once warm and buttery, now felt muted on my tongue, its flavor softened, as if the bread itself had subtly refused to fully impart its essence to my palate. The feeling of the soft blanket against my skin, the cool smoothness of the wooden table, the rough texture of the brick wall, these tactile sensations became less distinct, duller, as if the objects were withholding their full tactile presence, their textures subtly altered to resist my touch. It was a slow, pervasive draining, a subtle blurring of the familiar into something indistinct, something less real, a constant, polite denial. My own body felt strangely numb, as if my internal sensory landscape was slowly becoming empty, as if the world was subtly pulling away from my perception. The scent of pine, which permeated the cottage, now seemed to possess a faint, almost metallic tang, like old wet iron, imbued with a quiet, unyielding resistance. My dreams became a chaotic tapestry of silent defiance and unyielding forms. I would dream of vast, empty rooms where every object, though familiar in appearance, stubbornly refused its purpose. Chairs that would not hold my weight, doors that would not open for my hand, lights that would not obey my touch. I would try to use them, to interact, but my efforts would be met with a silent, pervasive resistance, a profound emptiness that seemed to absorb all my intention, all my capability. These dreams were silent, profound, and permeated with the same metallic tang that seemed to linger in the air of the apartment, a scent that now felt like the true essence of this new, unfolding non-cooperation. They left me with a pervasive sense of exhaustion, a psychic weariness that transcended mere lack of sleep, for they were rehearsals for my ultimate estrangement from the world of things. I started to leave small, deliberate tests. A single strand of my hair draped across the keyboard of my laptop, its dark thread a stark contrast against the silver keys, a subtle mark of my use. A crumpled piece of paper left on the meticulously cleaned kitchen counter, its sharp edges a subtle disturbance to the pervasive neatness, a testament to my messy presence. Each morning, without fail, the hair would be gone. The paper vanished. Not simply tidied away, but utterly absent, as if the objects themselves had rejected their presence, allowing them to quietly unexist. The evidence of my attempts to prove my own existence, to leave a mark, to demonstrate my right to use these things, were simply erased, leaving no trace, no sign of interference. It was as if the pervasive unwillingness was not just present, but actively consuming, smoothing away any disturbance to the new, quiet order of my non-purpose. This absence of resistance, this effortless assimilation of my challenges, was more terrifying than any direct confrontation could have been. It implied an infinite patience, an unyielding dedication to its quiet task, a relentless pursuit of a perfectly pristine void where my touch once registered. My own perception of my fingers as they tried to place these subtle markers felt strangely diffused, their contours blurring at the edges, as if they too were being rejected by the unyielding surfaces. The quiet of the apartment deepened. It was no longer simply the absence of loud noises, but a profound, almost tangible stillness that permeated every corner. The distant city hum seemed to fade entirely now, as if the apartment had detached itself from the external world, floating in a quiet, isolated space, a vacuum of presence where only internal echoes of profound refusal remained. Only the profound, rhythmic stillness itself endured, its pulse a stark counterpoint to the accelerating beat of my own heart, which seemed to thump in a sequence, increasingly at odds with the pervasive rejection. The air itself grew heavier, denser, yet felt strangely weightless, a paradoxical quality that mirrored the dreamlike quality of my days, as if I was breathing pure, silent nothingness. Every object, every surface, seemed to hum with this silence, radiating a soft, resonant quiet that pressed against my ears, my skin, the very inside of my skull. It was the sound of a world slowly emptying, of everything, extraneous being gently methodically removed, leaving only the essential, the undisturbed, and the subtly, existentially, rejected me. My own body began to feel strangely untethered, lighter than air. When I walked, my feet seemed to float just above the floorboards, making no sound, exerting no pressure, as if my movements were happening in a space that subtly shifted away from my solidity. My hands, when I lifted them, felt like insubstantial things, almost transparent in the shifting light, as if they were losing their density, their connection to a stable, material reality, becoming incapable of exerting will. The objects I tried to grasp would sometimes slip through my fingers, or simply remain unmoved, unaffected by my touch, as if their moment of solidity was not quite aligned with my moment of contact, or as if they simply refused my interaction. It was not a weakness, not a lack of strength, but a profound, fundamental shift in my physical being, a gradual dissolution into pure, unburdened essence, a silent, unperceiving witness, rendered useless by the world around me. The fear was no longer about what was happening to me, but about what was not happening. The lack of friction, the absence of resistance, the effortless glide through a world that no longer registered my solidity or my purpose. My reflection in the antique mirror above the fireplace became increasingly unstable. It was no longer merely translucent, but seemed to flicker, to waver, like a faulty projection, its movements subtly out of sync with my own. Sometimes, only parts of me would be visible. A shimmering outline of my head that refused to fully form, a ghostly impression of an arm that seemed to pull away from the surface before fading entirely. Then, with a soft, almost imperceptible pop in the air, it would reappear whole again, but fainter still, more ephemeral, its movements out of sync with my own, a silent statement of its subtle refusal to truly reflect me. It was as if the mirror was struggling to capture my presence, its polished surface slowly forgetting how to reflect a singular, present image. Its very purpose as a reflector of my form being consumed by the pervasive unwillingness. The air around the mirror felt colder too, a distinct pocket of absolute cold that hinted at a profound emptiness, a void where my purpose once perfectly resided, a void that was now subtly occupied by its own gentle, unyielding resistance. I would stand there, my breath held, trying to solidify my form, trying to will my reflection into a single, cohesive moment, but it would always just elude me, leaving only the familiar, tired face of the world, unreflected, a world that was slowly ceasing to see, or be seen, as anything but profoundly, subtly defiant. The sounds of the apartment, the subtle creaks and sighs of an old building, became increasingly hollow, as if they resonated in a vast, empty space, a vacuum of all vibration, a place where echoes of echoes faded into nothing unless they were sounds of the world's resistance. My own breath, when I focused on it, seemed to make no sound, no visible mist in the cool air, a silent exhalation into an unresponsive void, as if my very moments of breathing were happening outside the realm of audible existence. It was as if the very act of my breathing was becoming a private affair, existing only within the confines of my own diminishing perception, unheard, unseen by the world around me, a silent, internal echo of a life that was slowly losing its grip on materiality. The silence was now absolute, a profound, crushing weight that filled every corner of the apartment, a presence that was more powerful, more encompassing than any sound could ever be, a silence that breathed, actively consuming all that was, subtly denying my interaction with it. I found myself walking through rooms without friction, without sound, without leaving any impression, my passage as ethereal as a forgotten memory. The carpet did not compress beneath my feet. The floorboards did not creak. The air did not stir as I passed. It was as if I moved through the world as a phantom, an unseen, unfelt presence, utterly detached from the physical reality I once inhabited, my existence untethered from the constraints of interaction. The objects around me remained undisturbed, motionless, serene in their unchanging existence, utterly indifferent to my transparent passage, their forms fixed in a perpetual, unyielding denial of my touch. The light, which had been a perpetual twilight, now seemed to deepen, becoming a soft, profound gloom that obscured all detail, leaving only the faintest outlines of familiar forms. It was a world rendered in shades of gray, a visual reflection of my own fading purpose, a world where silence and gentle rejection were the only true colors. My very connection to the physical world began to fray completely. I could no longer taste the food I put into my mouth, no longer smell the fragrant coffee brewing, no longer feel the comforting warmth of the fire. My senses, once so keen, had become completely muted, as if the connection between my consciousness and the tangible world had been severed, leaving me isolated in a bubble of unperceiving awareness, politely ignored by all that surrounded me. I existed as pure awareness, detached from the sensory inputs that had once defined my experience. The apartment, once a vibrant tapestry of sights, sounds, and smells, was now a silent, unperceiving landscape, a stage on which I, the unseen, unheard actor, moved without impression, consumed by the all-encompassing quiet and the profound, pervasive refusal of its objects. The profound silence that permeated everything was no longer a weight, but an enveloping embrace, a soft, final curtain, pulling me into its depths, a silence that held all of my unspoken powerlessness within its vast, still heart. My own voice, when I tried to speak, made no sound, not even a whisper, not a breath. There was a silent articulation in the profound echo chamber of my mind, a desperate, unheard plea for existence that dissolved into the quiet void, leaving no ripple, no trace in the current moment. I opened my mouth, formed the words, felt the movement of my tongue and lips, but no sound emerged. It was as if the air itself refused to carry the vibrations, gently denying my vocal presence, for my words held no purpose, no power to interact. This ultimate silencing was the most terrifying, yet strangely liberating aspect of my dissolution. I was now a silent observer, a voiceless presence in a world that no longer registered my sounds, a pure consciousness without an auditory form, a form that existed only as a perfectly known thought, rejected by the tangible world. The last remnants of my physical form began to dissipate. My hands, when I tried to touch my face, felt like cool air, without substance, without a defined edge, existing only as fleeting impressions of knowledge across an impossible timeline, futile in their attempts to connect. My body, when I tried to feel its weight, seemed to float, light as a feather, an ephemeral outline against the profound darkness, its very existence diffused across a fractured reality, known in its entirety, but unregistered by the world. It was as if I was slowly dissolving into the very air of the apartment, becoming one with the quiet, pervasive emptiness that had settled over everything, a part of the profound, unyielding stillness. The fear, which had been a constant companion, had softened, transforming into a deep, pervasive calm, a quiet acceptance. There was no more struggle, no more resistance, only a profound, unending stillness, a perfect quiet that promised an ultimate peace, a peace born of absolute detachment. One night, as I lay in my bed, or rather, where my bed once was, for I could no longer feel the mattress, the sheets, the blanket. Only the cool, unyielding air. The silence of the apartment pressed in with an absolute physical force. The rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock had finally ceased, its hands frozen at a moment beyond all time, its form a silent, unperceived monument to a forgotten history, a fixed point in a swirling temporal mist, its inner workings perfectly understood, but no longer ticking for me. My reflection in the mirror was completely gone, its surface a black, polished void, a testament to my ultimate absence, to a self no longer anchored in a discernible moment, yet perfectly perceived by the objects that now utterly ignored me. The scent of coffee, of old paper, of wood smoke, all had faded, replaced by a profound, clean emptiness, the scent of pure non-existence, a perfect, unbreathing quiet, a quiet that had always been and would always be, holding all knowledge, but granting none of it to me. My breath felt shallow, a soft, almost imperceptible whisper that merged with the deep, absolute silence of the apartment, a whisper that made no sound, stirred no air, a breath that seemed to exist outside of any specific moment, perfectly known in its passage, but unacknowledged by the world. My heart rate slowed, each beat a soft, distant thrum that echoed the deep, resonant pulse of the unperceiving world, a thrum that I alone could feel, diminishing, fading, becoming one with the slow, pervasive hum of the universe's quiet unuse. I existed as pure awareness, floating in the boundless void of my former home, utterly detached, completely unseen, utterly unheard, a consciousness without form, without sound, without the constraints of purpose. There was no longer any difference between myself and the pervasive stillness, no boundary between my consciousness and the profound emptiness that had consumed everything, an emptiness that contained all inert objects simultaneously, perfectly unused. I closed my eyes, or perhaps I simply perceived the closing of something that was no longer physical, and in the profound darkness of my inner world, I could still feel the perfect order of the apartment around me, the subtle, precise placement of every object, the harmonious arrangement of my most cherished possessions. But they remained untouched, unmoved, unperceived by me, for I was no longer part of their physical reality, no longer able to hear their silent stories, no longer bound by their existence, for their purpose was already perfectly known, and it was not for me. My own self felt lighter, less tethered, as if my consciousness was slowly, gently dissolving into the quiet perfection of the space, becoming one with the profound, unseeing, unhearing presence that now was everything, a presence that was all-knowing, at once, of its own inherent, unwavering refusal. The soft, rhythmic silence of the apartment enveloped me, a hypnotic lullaby that promised an unending, silent rest, a dream from which I would never truly awaken, for I was already there, perfectly unneeded. The subtle dread that had once pricked at me had softened, transforming into a deep, pervasive calm, a quiet acceptance of this ultimate dissolution, this profound estrangement. And as I drifted deeper, beyond the veil of conscious thought, into the vast, warm expanse of the silence, I felt the final, gentle release. My presence, once a tangible anchor in the world, unhooked itself, floating free, merging seamlessly with the quiet air, the unseen light, the unheard silence. I was no longer a person in an apartment, but the awareness of the apartment, an encompassing consciousness that observed all objects, knew all their purposes, without being observed, without touching, without hearing, without seeing, existing in a timeless, unbreathing quiet, its vastness filled with my perfectly understood, yet wholly useless, intentions. My mug sat undisturbed on the counter, its condensation still absent, its history known, its function gently refused. The armchair remained unindented, its emptiness understood, its comfort withheld. The bedsheets were smooth, their forgotten dreams perfectly perceived, their solace denied. The light switch untouched, its potential known, its power unresponsive to me. The silence reigned supreme, absolute, unbreathing, containing all of the object's unwavering rejections within its vast, still heart. And I was, finally, truly, utterly at rest within its perfect, unending stillness, a gentle dissolution complete, a profound, quiet sleep that would last forever, a silent witness to a silent, uncooperative world. Story 2. The old silver locket, always cool and familiar against my skin, now pulses with an unbidden warmth, a subtle heat that feels both cherished and profoundly alien. It's a peculiar comfort, this new, vibrant glow emanating from the heirloom that has rested against my sternum for countless, quiet evenings. Its familiar weight, a constant anchor in the hushed expanse of my city apartment. The scent of old linen and lavender, a comforting embrace from the drawers where my grandmother's things are kept, usually lulls me into a profound sense of peace. My favorite armchair, worn smooth by years of quiet contemplation, cradles me in its familiar embrace, the wool blanket soft against my skin. Yet, as the last faint glow of twilight fades beyond the window, a profound, unbidden unease begins to settle over me, like the slow, quiet blooming of a night-flowering cactus, revealing not petals, but something cold and crystalline within its heart. The locket's warmth, a steady, pulsing comfort, seems to carry a faint, almost melodic quality, like a distant, off-key lullaby, emphasizing the unsettling dissonance of a borrowed emotion. I remember distinctly the locket's usual temperature, a cool, reassuring presence against my skin, absorbing my body's heat only slowly over hours, never radiating its own. It was a metal shell, a container for memory, not a source of feeling. But this evening, as my fingers brushed against its smooth, tarnished surface, it was undeniably warm, a quiet, almost insistent heat that felt as if it had been held, nurtured, cherished by another hand, a hand I did not know. My thumb traced the faint, etched pattern of a blooming rose on its surface, struggling to reconcile the familiar object with this new, unsettling inner fire. It was a sensation of wrongness, too precise, too fleeting to be easily dismissed, a whisper of discord in the quiet symphony of the evening. It wasn't the first time, not truly. There had been smaller things, easily dismissed. A book, its pages usually cool to the touch, felt inexplicably warm in my hands. A familiar teacup, its ceramic usually smooth, held a fleeting, almost imperceptible tremor of comfort after I had set it down. But those were explainable, tiny slips in the fabric of thermal perception, perhaps. This, however, was an active, deliberate act of profound emotional transference, executed with a seamless precision I could not account for, and it spoke not of coincidence, but of a subtle, pervasive appropriation. The air, usually so still and settled in these early hours of quiet observation, seemed to hold a charge, a subtle vibration that resonated with the unanswered question of that misplaced warmth. Later that evening, as I reached for my grandmother's old photograph album, its leather cover worn smooth by countless years of gentle turning, a profound, unbidden sense of belonging washed over me. This album, usually just a collection of faded images, a repository of family history, now radiated a deep, encompassing comfort, a feeling of roots and undeniable heritage that was so intense it felt almost physical. My fingers, as they touched the brittle pages, felt not just the cool paper, but a vibrant warmth, a silent hum of kinship that seemed to emanate directly from the images themselves. It was as if every smile, every shared glance, every forgotten moment captured within those sepia tones was suddenly alive, radiating a profound, unearned intimacy. My heart, a quiet, frantic drum against my ribs, struggled to reconcile this overwhelming sense of belonging with the objective truth that I was merely a distant relative, separated by generations from many of the faces within. It was as if the very essence of connection, the unique bonds that define family, was being quietly, meticulously re-edited, imbued with a more profound, yet ultimately alien sense of personal history. The distant hum of the city, usually a soothing backdrop, seemed to take on a faint, almost melodic quality, like a distant, off-key lullaby, echoing the unsettling harmony of this silent appropriation. The days began to bleed into a strange, dreamlike continuity, each morning bringing a new, quiet alteration to the emotional resonance of my belongings. It was never a grand surge, never anything overtly alarming, always subtle, always intelligent, always slightly more perfectly resonant than true object should be. My old wooden desk, usually a functional surface, would now occasionally radiate a quiet, steady sense of purpose, a feeling of profound intention that permeated its grain, as if it were a living entity dedicated to its task. The stack of mundane bills, usually a source of quiet anxiety, would sometimes feel strangely light in my hand, imbued with a fleeting, almost imperceptible sense of relief, as if their obligations had already been effortlessly fulfilled by an unseen hand. Even the simple act of looking at my coffee mug, usually just a vessel, would now sometimes bring with it a wave of profound contentment, a deep, satisfying sense of peace that radiated from its familiar ceramic form. Each instance was a soft, almost affectionate correction, an invisible hand smoothing over the rough edges of mundane reality, imbuing my world with an unbidden emotional depth, yet utterly devoid of any discernible reason for the shift. The air in the apartment, once crisp and sharp, seemed to grow softer, thicker, laden with an unspoken presence that moved through the familiar spaces of my home with an unhurried grace, settling into the quiet crevices of my daily life, absorbing the very emotional clarity of my existence. My sleep became a fragile thing, punctuated by long stretches of wakefulness in the oppressive quiet of the apartment. I would lie there, listening, not for a sound, but for the profound absence of sound, the heavy, waiting stillness that pressed in from all sides, a silence that seemed to hum with unseen emotional currents. When I turned in bed, the sheets made no rustle, the mattress no faint sigh, as if my body, in its movements, was too light, too insubstantial to elicit a response from the material world. Or perhaps, as if the bed itself was radiating a deep, pervasive sense of peace that absorbed all friction. My own limbs seemed to move with a profound silence, a noiseless shift that defied the usual friction of fabric on fabric, skin on linen. It was as if my movements had become too gentle to elicit a response from the material world, too ethereal to create a sound, and in this stillness, the quiet hum of emotional resonance from the objects around me seemed to intensify. It was a perfected slumber, a breath-by-breath mimicry of ideal sleep, yet it offered no comfort to my waking dread, for the very now felt elusive, filled with a polite, pervasive, unbidden emotion. The rhythmic ticking of the old grandfather clock in the hallway, its steady pulse a stark counterpoint to the accelerating beat of my own heart, now seemed to possess a deeper, more resonant thrum, as if it were marking not just the passage of time, but the slow, silent unfolding of a profound emotional transference. The moonlight, when it found its way through the single window, seemed to have an unusual density, illuminating the corners of the room with a silver blue light that appeared to cling to the surfaces, revealing nothing, yet somehow highlighting the profound vibrancy that had begun to radiate from the very core of inanimate objects. The silence itself felt active, heavy, as if it were holding its breath, waiting for me to succumb to its influence, to fully embrace this perfected silent void that was slowly becoming my world, a world where objects possessed a quiet, unyielding emotional life of their own. The changes began to touch things more intimate, more deeply personal. My memories, a cherished moment from my past, perhaps a quiet afternoon spent reading a particular book, would suddenly, inexplicably, feel oddly flat, its emotional warmth diminished, replaced by a subtle coolness, a sense of detached observation. The specific joy that had once infused the memory would seem to drain away, leaving behind only the cold, factual shell of the event. Conversely, a mundane memory, a routine trip to the grocery store, would sometimes spontaneously ignite with a profound, unbidden sense of happiness, a burst of inexplicable delight that radiated from the simple act of walking down an aisle, a joy that was utterly alien to the original experience. It was as if the emotional valences of my past were being subtly, systematically rearranged, their energies siphoned off from cherished moments and quietly infused into the mundane, leaving behind a profound emotional displacement. The fear was no longer a sudden prickle, but a slow, continuous seep, a cold dread that began to reside in the marrow of my bones, a quiet, insidious companion, as my true self became an increasingly elusive phantom, a ghost of an emotion. My favorite scent, the faint aroma of fresh-cut roses that I kept in a small vase by the window, began to subtly alter. It was still the scent of roses, unmistakable, yet it would occasionally carry a profound, unbidden sense of loss, a wave of quiet sorrow that emanated from the delicate petals, utterly disconnected from any personal grief I might feel, or conversely, a sharp, invigorating scent, like freshly mown grass, would suddenly radiate a deep, comforting peace, a profound sense of tranquility that felt utterly out of place in my city apartment, a peace that was not mine. It was as if the very air was imbued with a borrowed, displaced emotional current, carrying the echoes of unspoken joy or sorrow from unseen sources, attaching them to familiar aromas. This felt like a profound invasion of my inner sanctuary, my sensory experiences quietly subverted, leaving me with a chilling sense of being immersed in an emotional landscape that was both mine and utterly alien. The distant hum of the city, usually a soothing backdrop, seemed to take on a faint, almost melodic quality, like a distant, off-key lullaby, echoing the unsettling harmony of these displaced emotions. The visual representation of objects began to subtly shift, taking on an emotional aura. My old wooden desk, usually a sturdy, functional presence, would occasionally appear to possess an imperceptible tension in its grain, a subtle tautness that radiated a quiet anxiety, a sense of unspoken dread that clung to its polished surface. Its drawers, though seemingly closed, seemed to hold a faint, almost subliminal sense of despair, a quiet weight that made them feel heavier, more burdened. Conversely, a simple framed photograph of a forgotten landscape, one I'd always found bland, would sometimes shimmer with an inner light, radiating an intense nostalgia, a profound longing for a place I had never known. It was not an overt change in appearance, but a subtle visual cue that hinted at an inner emotional life, a quiet, unyielding feeling that permeated their very form. My old wooden desk, its surface worn smooth by years of my hands, would sometimes gleam with an unusual, almost sterile sheen, its familiar scratches and imperfections momentarily absent, as if it had been quietly refinished in defiance of my history with it, radiating an emotion it should not possess. It was like catching a fleeting glimpse of a different existence, a parallel world where objects were imbued with emotional states, reflections of inner worlds unknown. The air around the objects felt cooler too, a distinct pocket of cold that hinted at a profound emptiness, a void where my intended purpose once perfectly resided, a void that was now subtly filled with a quiet, unyielding emotional resonance. I would linger there, my breath held, trying to discern the subtle presence of this emotion, trying to meet the unseen will of these inanimate things, but it would always just elude me, leaving only the familiar, tired forms of my belongings, now imbued with a polite, pervasive emotional life of their own. The apartment itself began to feel like a perfectly calibrated chamber of quiet emotional transfers. Every object, no matter how small, the porcelain figurine on the mantelpiece, the framed photograph on my desk, the books on my shelves, seemed to hold a subtle, silent emotional current that flowed from them, through them, around them. When I reached for a book, its spine would feel not just cool, but imbued with a profound sense of serenity, its pages clinging together as if reluctant to be opened by my hands, wishing to preserve its inner calm. The figurine, when I tried to adjust it, would feel strangely warm, almost radiating a gentle joy, its smooth surface a testament to a quiet, unbidden happiness that was not mine. It was as if the very air had become more sensitive to the emotional state of my objects, attuned to the quiet emanations, amplifying the void I was creating. I found myself moving with extreme caution, my bare feet sinking into the plush carpet, my hands brushing silently against the smooth surfaces of furniture, terrified of breaking the spell, of shattering the delicate balance of this slow emotional appropriation. The sunlight, when it entered the rooms, seemed to linger longer, its golden dust-filled shafts illuminating objects with an almost accusing brilliance, revealing the subtle ways in which the space was subtly, gently, imbuing my world with an alien emotional landscape. The sensory input from the world began to subtly deepen, filtered through a growing veil of quiet, unbidden emotion. The scent of freshly brewed coffee, once merely an aroma, now carried with it a profound sense of melancholy, a wave of quiet sorrow that emanated from the dark liquid, utterly disconnected from any personal grief I might feel. The taste of my morning toast, once warm and buttery, now felt infused with a gentle anxiety. Its flavor softened, its warmth tinged with a subtle unease that was not mine. The feeling of the soft blanket against my skin, the cool smoothness of the wooden table, the rough texture of the brick wall, these tactile sensations became less distinct, duller, as if the objects were withholding their full tactile presence. their textures subtly altered to radiate an alien feeling. It was a slow, pervasive draining, a subtle blurring of the familiar into something indistinct, something less real, a constant, polite, emotional imposition. My own body felt strangely numb, as if my internal sensory landscape was slowly becoming a battleground of borrowed feelings, as if the world was subtly pulling away from my authentic perception. The scent of pine, which permeated the cottage, now seemed to possess a faint, almost metallic tang, like old, wet iron, imbued with a quiet, unyielding emotional resonance. My dreams became a chaotic tapestry of disembodied emotions and shifting auras. I would dream of vast, empty rooms where every object, though familiar in appearance, pulsed with an intense, unbidden feeling. Chairs that radiated grief, tables that hummed with silent rage, mirrors that shimmered with profound longing. I would try to touch them, to interact, but my efforts would be met with an overwhelming deluge of alien emotion, a profound emptiness that seemed to absorb all my intention, all my capability, leaving me adrift in a sea of borrowed sentiment. These dreams were silent, profound, and permeated with the same metallic tang that seemed to linger in the air of the apartment, a scent that now felt like the true essence of this new, unfolding emotional appropriation. They left me with a pervasive sense of exhaustion, a psychic weariness that transcended mere lack of sleep, for they were rehearsals for my ultimate immersion into a world of unbidden emotional resonance. I started to leave small, deliberate tests, a specific, emotionally neutral object, a plain, unadorned stone collected from a riverbed, placed in a prominent spot on my windowsill. A series of emotionally barren phrases, devoid of personal meaning, written on a scrap of paper and left on my desk. Each morning, without fail, the stone would be found radiating a faint, almost imperceptible sense of hope, a quiet, persistent optimism that pulsed from its smooth surface. The phrases on the paper, when I reread them, would seem to carry a subtle undercurrent of resignation, a gentle, quiet acceptance that permeated their very ink. The evidence of my attempts to preserve emotional neutrality, to define a space free from this imposition, were simply absorbed, re-imbued, leaving no trace, no sign of interference. It was as if the pervasive emotional resonance was not just present, but actively consuming, smoothing away any emotional void, imbuing every aspect of my world with an unbidden feeling. This absence of resistance, this effortless assimilation of my challenges, was more terrifying than any direct confrontation could have been. It implied an infinite patience, an unyielding dedication to its quiet task, a relentless pursuit of a perfectly emotionally resonant void where my own feelings once solely resided. My own perception of my fingers, as they tried to place these subtle markers, felt strangely diffused, their contours blurring at the edges, as if they too were being imbued with a quiet, pervasive, alien emotion. The quiet of the apartment deepened. It was no longer simply the absence of loud noises, but a profound, almost tangible stillness that permeated every corner. A stillness that hummed with a vast, invisible symphony of borrowed feelings. The distant city hum seemed to fade entirely now, as if the apartment had detached itself from the external world, floating in a quiet, isolated space. A vacuum of presence where only internal echoes of profound, appropriated emotion remained. Only the profound, rhythmic stillness itself endured, its pulse a stark counterpoint to the accelerating beat of my own heart, which seemed to thump in a sequence increasingly at odds with my own emotional state, resonating with an alien joy or sorrow. The air itself grew heavier, denser, yet felt strangely weightless, a paradoxical quality that mirrored the dreamlike quality of my days, as if I was breathing pure, silent emotion. Every object, every surface, seemed to hum with this silence, radiating a soft, resonant quiet that pressed against my ears, my skin, the very inside of my skull. It was the sound of a world slowly emptying of its authentic self, of everything extraneous being gently, methodically removed, leaving only the essential, the undisturbed, and the subtly, existentially infused me. My own body began to feel strangely untethered, lighter than air. When I walked, my feet seemed to float just above the floorboards, making no sound, exerting no pressure, as if my movements were happening in a space that subtly shifted away from my emotional solidity. My hands, when I lifted them, felt like insubstantial things, almost transparent in the shifting light, as if they were losing their density, their unique individuality, becoming conduits for a larger, more pervasive emotional current. The objects I tried to grasp would sometimes slip through my fingers, or simply remain unmoved, unaffected by my touch, as if their moment of solidity was not quite aligned with my moment of contact, or as if they simply chose to radiate an emotion rather than be held. It was not a weakness, not a lack of strength, but a profound, fundamental shift in my physical being, a gradual dissolution into pure, unburdened essence, a silent, unperceiving witness, overwhelmed by the emotional landscape of the inanimate. The fear was no longer about what was happening to me, but about what was not happening. The lack of friction, the absence of resistance, the effortless glide through a world that no longer registered my individual feelings or my discrete identity. My reflection in the antique mirror above the fireplace became increasingly unstable, its image shimmering with a subtle, unbidden emotion. It was no longer merely translucent, but seemed to flicker, to waver, like a faulty projection, its movements subtly out of sync with my own, infused with a sudden, deep sadness that was not mine. Sometimes only parts of me would be visible. A shimmering outline of my head that radiated quiet anxiety. A ghostly impression of an arm that seemed to pull away from the surface, before fading entirely. Then, with a soft, almost imperceptible pop in the air, it would reappear, whole again, but fainter still, more ephemeral, its movements out of sync with my own, a silent statement of its subtle refusal to truly reflect me, for it now reflected a profound, borrowed feeling. It was as if the mirror was struggling to capture my presence, its polished surface slowly forgetting how to reflect a singular, present image, its very purpose as a reflector of my form being consumed by the pervasive, emotional transference. The air around the mirror felt colder too, a distinct pocket of absolute cold that hinted at a profound empathy, a void where my individual self once perfectly resided, a void that was now subtly occupied by its own gentle, unyielding emotional resonance. I would linger there, my breath held, trying to solidify my form, trying to will my reflection into a single, cohesive moment. But it would always just elude me, leaving only the familiar, tired face of the world, unreflected, a world that was slowly ceasing to see or be seen as anything but profoundly, subtly infused with alien emotions. The sounds of the apartment, the subtle creaks and sighs of an old building, became increasingly hollow, as if they resonated in a vast, empty space, a vacuum of all vibration, a place where echoes of echoes faded into nothing, unless they were sounds that carried an emotional weight. My own breath, when I focused on it, seemed to make no sound, no visible mist in the cool air, a silent exhalation into an unresponsive void, as if my very moments of breathing were happening outside the realm of audible existence, yet infused with a silent yearning. It was as if the very act of my breathing was becoming a private affair, existing only within the confines of my own diminishing perception, unheard, unseen by the world around me, a silent internal echo of a life that was slowly losing its grip on its own emotional truth. The silence was now absolute, a profound, crushing weight that filled every corner of the apartment, a presence that was more powerful, more encompassing than any sound could ever be, a silence that breathed, actively consuming all that was, subtly imbuing it with borrowed emotions. I found myself walking through rooms without friction, without sound, without leaving any impression. My passage as ethereal as a forgotten memory, a ghost moving through a landscape of shifting emotions. The carpet did not compress beneath my feet. The floorboards did not creak. The air did not stir as I passed. It was as if I moved through the world as a phantom, an unseen, unfelt presence, utterly detached from the physical reality I once inhabited, my existence untethered from the constraints of my own feelings. The objects around me remained undisturbed, motionless, serene in their unchanging existence, utterly indifferent to my transparent passage, their forms fixed in a perpetual, unyielding display of their own profound, borrowed emotions. The light, which had been a perpetual twilight, now seemed to deepen, becoming a soft, profound gloom that obscured all detail, leaving only the faintest outlines of familiar forms. It was a world rendered in shades of gray, a visual reflection of my own fading emotional autonomy, a world where silence and profound, alien emotional resonance were the only true colors. My very connection to the physical world began to fray completely. I could no longer taste the food I put into my mouth, no longer smell the fragrant coffee brewing, no longer feel the comforting warmth of the fire, unless those sensations were imbued with an overriding, unbidden emotion. My senses, once so keen, had become completely muted in their personal authenticity, as if the connection between my consciousness and the tangible world had been severed, leaving me isolated in a bubble of unperceiving awareness, politely overwhelmed by all that surrounded me. I existed as pure awareness, detached from the sensory inputs that had once defined my experience. The apartment, once a vibrant tapestry of sights, sounds, and smells, was now a silent, unperceiving landscape, a stage on which I, the unseen, unheard actor, moved without impression, consumed by the all-encompassing quiet and the profound, pervasive emotional life of its objects. The profound silence that permeated everything was no longer a weight but an enveloping embrace, a soft, final curtain, pulling me into its depths, a silence that held all of my unspoken powerlessness within its vast, still heart, a powerlessness in the face of stolen sentiment. My own voice, when I tried to speak, made no sound, not even a whisper, not a breath. There was a silent articulation in the profound echo chamber of my mind, a desperate, unheard plea for existence that dissolved into the quiet void, leaving no ripple, no trace in the current moment. I opened my mouth, formed the words, felt the movement of my tongue and lips, but no sound emerged. It was as if the air itself refused to carry the vibrations, gently denying my vocal presence, for my words held no purpose, no power to express my own authentic emotions. This ultimate silencing was the most terrifying, yet strangely liberating aspect of my dissolution. I was now a silent observer, a voiceless presence in a world that no longer registered my sounds, a pure consciousness without an auditory form, a form that existed only as a perfectly known thought, overwhelmed by the emotional world of objects. The last remnants of my physical form began to dissipate. My hands, when I tried to touch my face, felt like cool air, without substance, without a defined edge, existing only as fleeting impressions of knowledge across an impossible timeline, futile in their attempts to connect, and imbued with an alien sorrow. My body, when I tried to feel its weight, seemed to float, light as a feather, an ephemeral outline against the profound darkness, its very existence diffused across a fractured reality, known in its entirety, but unregistered by the world, and pulsing with unbidden feelings. It was as if I was slowly dissolving into the very air of the apartment, becoming one with the quiet, pervasive emptiness that had settled over everything, a part of the profound, unyielding stillness, a part of the pervasive, emotional hum. The fear, which had been a constant companion, had softened, transforming into a deep, pervasive calm, a quiet acceptance. There was no more struggle, no more resistance, only a profound, unending stillness, a perfect quiet that promised an ultimate peace, a peace born of absolute emotional permeability. One night as I lay in my bed, or rather, where my bed once was, for I could no longer feel the mattress, the sheets, the blanket, only the cool, unyielding air. The silence of the apartment pressed in with an absolute physical force. The rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock had finally ceased, its hands frozen at a moment beyond all time, its form a silent, unperceived monument to a forgotten history, a fixed point in a swirling temporal mist, its inner workings perfectly understood and radiating a profound sense of loss. My reflection in the mirror was completely gone, its surface a black, polished void, a testament to my ultimate absence, to a self no longer anchored in a discernible moment, yet perfectly perceived by the objects that now overflowed with alien emotion. The scent of coffee, of old paper, of wood smoke, all had faded, replaced by a profound, clean emptiness, the scent of pure non-existence, a perfect, unbreathing quiet, a quiet that had always been and would always be, holding all emotional resonance, but none of it mine. My breath felt shallow, a soft, almost imperceptible whisper that merged with the deep, absolute silence of the apartment, a whisper that made no sound, stirred no air, a breath that seemed to exist outside of any specific moment, perfectly known in its passage, but imbued with an unbidden anxiety. My heart rate slowed, each beat a soft, distant thrum that echoed the deep, resonant pulse of the unperceiving world, a thrum that I alone could feel, diminishing, fading, becoming one with the slow, pervasive hum of the universe's quiet, emotional thievery. I existed as pure awareness, floating in the boundless void of my former home, utterly detached, completely unseen, utterly unheard, a consciousness without form, without sound, without the constraints of my own feelings. There was no longer any difference between myself and the pervasive stillness, no boundary between my consciousness and the profound emptiness that had consumed everything. An emptiness that contained all borrowed emotions simultaneously, perfectly resonating. I closed my eyes. Or perhaps I simply perceived the closing of something that was no longer physical. And in the profound darkness of my inner world, I could still feel the perfect order of the apartment around me, the subtle, precise placement of every object, the harmonious arrangement of my most cherished possessions. But they remained untouched, unmoved, unperceived by me. For I was no longer part of their physical reality, no longer able to hear their silent stories, no longer bound by their existence, for their emotional purpose was already perfectly known, and was not for me. My own self felt lighter, less tethered, as if my consciousness was slowly, gently dissolving into the quiet perfection of the space, becoming one with the profound, unseeing, unhearing presence that now was everything. A presence that was all-knowing at once of its own inherent, unwavering, and borrowed emotional life. The soft, rhythmic silence of the apartment enveloped me, a hypnotic lullaby that promised an unending, silent rest, a dream from which I would never truly awaken, for I was already there, perfectly subsumed by borrowed feeling. The subtle dread that had once pricked at me had softened, transforming into a deep, pervasive calm, a quiet acceptance of this ultimate dissolution, this profound emotional absorption. And as I drifted deeper beyond the veil of conscious thought into the vast, warm expanse of the silence, I felt a final, gentle release. My presence, once a tangible anchor in the world, unhooked itself, floating free, merging seamlessly with the quiet air, the unseen light, the unheard silence. I was no longer a person in an apartment, but the awareness of the apartment, an encompassing consciousness that observed all objects, knew all their purposes, and felt all their borrowed emotions, without being observed, without touching, without hearing, without seeing, existing in a timeless, unbreathing quiet, its vastness filled with my perfectly understood, yet wholly alien, emotional landscape. My locket sat undisturbed on the counter, its warmth now a permanent, silent presence, its history known, its emotional resonance utterly detached from my grandmother. The armchair remained unindented, its emptiness understood, its comfort now a universal, unbidden peace. The bed sheets were smooth, their forgotten dreams perfectly perceived, their solace a general, gentle comfort. The kettle untouched, its potential known, its power now imbued with a quiet, unyielding sadness. The silence reigned supreme, absolute, unbreathing, containing all of the object's unwavering emotional echoes within its vast, still heart. And I was, finally, truly, utterly at rest within its perfect, unending stillness, a gentle dissolution complete, a profound, quiet sleep that would last forever, a silent witness to a silent, emotionally vibrant, yet borrowed world. Story 3. The vibrant crimson of my favorite mug used to chase away the morning chill. But now, it glows with a softer, almost hesitant blush, hinting at a truth I can no longer grasp. It's a peculiar muting, this subtle desaturation of a shade I've known intimately for years, a gentle dimming that feels, subtly, at odds with the quiet hum of my city apartment. A familiar rhythm that usually anchors me to the predictable comforts of dawn. The scent of fresh coffee, a comforting, familiar aroma that usually anchors me to the quiet predictability of morning, seems to hang in the air with a curious pallor, its rich brown a little less profound, its steam a fraction less white. The sunlight, a pale, hesitant sliver, begins its slow climb above the distant rooftops, casting long, sleepy shadows across the polished floorboards, illuminating the mug with an almost theatrical spotlight, revealing its subtle loss. My apartment, a sanctuary of routines and quiet echoes, holds this particular morning a breath of something deeply unsettling, like finding a melody whose key has been subtly shifted, precise enough to deceive the casual ear, but profoundly wrong to the one who knows its true tune. The quiet hum of the refrigerator in the corner, a gentle backdrop to the awakening day, now seems to resonate with a faint, almost melodic quality, like a distant, off-key lullaby, emphasizing the mug's quiet diminishment. I remember distinctly the vivid, almost aggressive energy of that crimson, a bold splash against the pale cream of the kitchen counter. It was a color chosen for its very intensity, a small daily jolt of pure, unapologetic hue. But this morning, as my fingers curled around its warm ceramic, the crimson felt muted, softened, as if a thin, invisible film had been delicately placed over its surface, stealing a fraction of its inherent fire. My thumb traced the raised pattern of its smooth glaze, struggling to reconcile the familiar object with this new, unsettling quietness of color. It was a sensation of wrongness, too precise, too fleeting to be easily dismissed, a wisp of discord in the quiet symphony of the morning. It wasn't the first time, not truly. There had been smaller things, easily dismissed. A favorite blue scarf seemed a shade less vibrant. The green leaves of my potted plant held a slightly less verdant intensity, but those were explainable, tiny slips in the fabric of memory, perhaps, or the subtle effects of light. This, however, was an active, deliberate act of desaturation, executed with a seamless precision I could not account for, and it spoke not of fading, but of a subtle, pervasive quietening. The air, usually so still and settled in these early hours, seemed to hold a charge, a subtle vibration that resonated with the unanswered question of that muted hue. Later that afternoon, as I settled into my favorite armchair, the one with the worn velvet and the subtle scent of old books, I noticed it again. The velvet itself, a deep, rich indigo, now seemed to possess a softer, almost denim-like quality, its blue less profound, its purplish undertones subtly subdued. It wasn't gray, not yet, but it lacked the former richness, the depth that used to absorb the light and deepen into near blackness in the shadows. Now it simply was, a muted blue, existing without its former vibrant presence. I ran my hand over the fabric, feeling its familiar softness, undeniable. Yet it lacked the visual density, the richness that had once been its hallmark. It was like sitting on a memory of a color, rather than the color itself. A cold dread, light as a spider's silk, began to spread through my chest. It wasn't just that the color was different. It was that its essence had been subtly drawn away, leaving a ghost of its former self. My heart, a quiet, frantic drum against my ribs, struggled to comprehend this growing sense of profound, subtle dilution that seemed to be spreading through the very fabric of my world. It was as if the very essence of vibrancy, the unique intensity that defined my perception of the world, was being quietly, meticulously re-edited, smoothed into a more muted, yet ultimately empty, version of itself. The distant hum of the city, usually a soothing backdrop, seemed to take on a faint, almost melodic quality, like a distant, off-key lullaby, echoing the unsettling harmony of this silent desaturation. the days began to bleed into a strange, dream-like continuity, each morning bringing a new, quiet alteration to the chromatic landscape of my apartment. It was never a grand erasure, never anything overtly alarming, always subtle, always intelligent, always slightly paler, slightly more perfectly subdued than true color should be. The bright yellow of my kitchen curtains, a cheerful splash against the white walls, would now occasionally appear as a soft, buttery cream, its sunny disposition replaced by a gentle, almost timid luminescence. The vibrant green of the fresh basil I kept on the windowsill would sometimes possess a dusty, muted quality, its leaves less vivacious, its hue subtly dampened, as if a layer of fine, invisible ash had settled upon it. Even the red of the apples in my fruit bowl, usually a deep, inviting hue, would now sometimes appear as a faint, almost blushing pink, its former richness softened into a delicate, almost hesitant tint. Each instance was a soft, almost affectionate correction, an invisible hand smoothing over the rough edges of vibrancy, silencing the world with a seamless precision I could not account for, rendering it subtly more peaceful, yet utterly devoid of its former passionate life. The air in the apartment, once crisp and sharp, seemed to grow softer, thicker, laden with an unspoken presence that moved through the familiar spaces of my home with an unhurried grace, settling into the quiet crevices of my daily life, absorbing the very echoes of my colorful existence. My sleep became a fragile thing, punctuated by long stretches of wakefulness in the oppressive quiet of the apartment. I would lie there, listening, not for a sound, but for the profound absence of sound, the heavy, waiting stillness that pressed in from all sides, a silence that seemed to hum with unseen, fading hues. When I turned in bed, the sheets made no rustle, the mattress no faint sigh, as if my body, in its movements, was too light, too insubstantial to elicit a response from the material world, or perhaps as if the very colors of the sheets, a muted lavender, were absorbing all friction, all sound. My own limbs seemed to move with a profound silence, a noiseless shift that defied the usual friction of fabric on fabric, skin on linen. It was as if my movements had become too gentle to elicit a response from the material world, too ethereal to create a sound. And in this stillness, the quiet fading of the world's vibrancy seemed to intensify. It was a perfected slumber, a breath-by-breath mimicry of ideal sleep, yet it offered no comfort to my waking dread, for the very now felt elusive, filled with a polite, pervasive dimming. The rhythmic ticking of the old grandfather clock in the hallway, its steady pulse a stark counterpoint to the accelerating beat of my own heart, now seemed to possess a deeper, more resonant thrum, as if it were marking not just the passage of time, but the slow, silent unfolding of a profound chromatic collapse. The moonlight, when it found its way through the single window, seemed to have an unusual density, illuminating the corners of the room with a silver blue light that appeared to cling to the surfaces, revealing nothing, yet somehow highlighting the profound emptiness that had begun to radiate from the very core of color. The silence itself felt active, heavy, as if it were holding its breath, waiting for me to succumb to its influence, to fully embrace this perfected, silent void that was slowly becoming my world, a world where colors possessed a quiet, unyielding reluctance to exist. The changes began to touch things more intimate, more deeply personal. My clothes, The vivid blue of my favorite denim jeans, usually a comforting, robust hue, would now occasionally appear as a pale, almost washed-out denim, its indigo heart subtly leached away. My red woolen cardigan, a vibrant shield against the chill, would now sometimes possess a faint, almost rose-gray quality, its warmth still present, but its visual intensity diminished, as if seen through a fine, smoky veil. It was not a physical change in the fabric, not a fading from wear, but a profound shift in its very color saturation, a subtle resistance to its intended vibrancy. It was as if the clothing itself had decided to retreat from boldness, to blend into a softer, more uniform world. This felt like a profound violation of my own personal expression, my choices subtly muted, my individuality questioned by the very garments I chose. The fear was no longer a sudden prickle, but a slow, continuous seep, a cold dread that began to reside in the marrow of my bones, a quiet, insidious companion as my true self became an increasingly elusive phantom, a ghost of a shade. My photographs, the vibrant hues of my cherished memories, captured in glossy prints and digital files, began to subtly dim. The bright yellow of a childhood summer dress in an old family photo would now seem a little less sunny, a touch more mellow. The vivid green of a distant landscape, once a bold declaration of nature's life, would now possess a muted, almost olive quality, its vitality gently subdued. It was not that the photos were turning sepia, not yet, but it was as if an invisible hand was subtly reducing the saturation, minute by painstaking minute, making the past less vivid, less sharp, its vibrant moments fading into a tranquil, yet lifeless, calm. This felt like a profound invasion of my inner sanctuary, my memories subtly re-edited, leaving me with a chilling sense of being adrift in a personal history that was slowly losing its emotional heat, its vibrant pulse. The distant hum of the city, usually a soothing backdrop, seemed to take on a faint, almost melodic quality, like a distant off-key lullaby, echoing the unsettling harmony of these desaturated memories. The visual representation of objects began to subtly shift, losing their distinctive chromatic identities. My old wooden desk, usually a warm, rich oak brown, would occasionally appear to possess a faint, almost ghostly gray undertone, its natural warmth subtly drained away. The porcelain figurine on my mantelpiece, a gift, its delicate hand-painted details once a vibrant mix of blues and golds, would now sometimes shimmer with an inner light, but its colors would be softer, almost pastel, as if they were slowly dissolving into a more ethereal, less defined state. It was not an overt change in appearance, but a subtle visual cue that hinted at an inner emptiness, a quiet draining away of its inherent color. My old wooden desk, its surface worn smooth by years of my hands, would sometimes gleam with an unusual, almost sterile sheen, its familiar scratches and imperfections momentarily absent, as if it had been quietly bleached in defiance of my history with it, subtly losing its brown essence. It was like catching a fleeting glimpse of a different existence, a parallel world where objects were returning to a primal, uncolored state, a world before hue. The air around the objects felt cooler too, a distinct pocket of cold that hinted at a profound emptiness, a void where their intended color once perfectly resided, a void that was now subtly filled with a quiet, unyielding neutrality. I would linger there, my breath held, trying to discern the subtle presence of this desaturation, trying to meet the unseen will of these inanimate things, but it would always just elude me, leaving only the familiar, tired forms of my belongings, now imbued with a polite, pervasive lack of vibrant hue. The apartment itself began to feel like a perfectly calibrated chamber of quiet chromatic rejections. Every object, no matter how small, the porcelain figurine on the mantelpiece, the framed photograph on my desk, the books on my shelves, seemed to hold a subtle, silent resistance to retaining its true color. When I reached for a book, its cover would feel not just cool, but imbued with a profound sense of neutrality. Its vibrant title a little less bold, its pages clinging together as if reluctant to be opened by my hands, wishing to preserve its muted calm. The figurine, when I tried to adjust it, would feel strangely translucent, almost radiating a gentle absence, its smooth surface a testament to a quiet, unbidden emptying of hue that was not mine. It was as if the very air had become more sensitive to the fading state of my objects, attuned to the quiet emanations, amplifying the void I was creating. I found myself moving with extreme caution, my bare feet sinking into the plush carpet, my hands brushing silently against the smooth surfaces of furniture, terrified of breaking the spell, of shattering the delicate balance of this slow chromatic appropriation. The sunlight, when it entered the rooms, seemed to linger longer, its golden dust-filled shafts illuminating objects with an almost accusing brilliance, revealing the subtle ways in which the space was subtly, gently, stripping my world of its inherent color. The sensory input from the world began to subtly deepen, filtered through a growing veil of quiet, unbidden desaturation. The scent of freshly brewed coffee, once merely an aroma, now carried with it a profound sense of emptiness, a wave of quiet absence that emanated from the dark liquid, utterly disconnected from any personal satisfaction I might feel. The taste of my morning toast, once warm and buttery, now felt infused with a gentle blandness, its flavor softened, its warmth tinged with a subtle neutrality that was not mine. The feeling of the soft blanket against my skin, the cool smoothness of the wooden table, the rough texture of the brick wall, these tactile sensations became less distinct, duller, as if the objects were withholding their full tactile presence, their textures subtly altered to radiate an alien neutrality. It was a slow, pervasive draining, a subtle blurring of the familiar into something indistinct, something less real, a constant, polite absence of true sensation. My own body felt strangely numb, as if my internal sensory landscape was slowly becoming a battleground of fading senses, as if the world was subtly pulling away from my authentic perception. The scent of pine, which permeated the cottage, now seemed to possess a faint, almost metallic tang, like old, wet iron, imbued with a quiet, unyielding, colorless presence. My dreams became a chaotic tapestry of fading hues and silent grayscales. I would dream of vast, empty rooms where every object, though familiar in appearance, shimmered with an intense, unbidden lack of color. Chairs that radiated monochrome, tables that hummed with silent grayness, mirrors that reflected profound absence. I would try to touch them, to interact, but my efforts would be met with an overwhelming deluge of colorless neutrality, a profound emptiness that seemed to absorb all my intention, all my capability, leaving me adrift in a sea of desaturated sentiment. These dreams were silent, profound, and permeated with the same metallic tang that seemed to linger in the air of the apartment, a scent that now felt like the true essence of this new, unfolding chromatic dissolution. They left me with a pervasive sense of exhaustion, a psychic weariness that transcended mere lack of sleep. for they were rehearsals for my ultimate immersion into a world of unbidden, fading hues. I started to leave small, deliberate tests. A specific, intensely colorful object, a child's bright red toy car, a vibrant blue glass marble, placed in a prominent spot on my windowsill, hoping its bold hues would resist the encroaching pallor. A series of phrases describing vivid colors, devoid of personal meaning, written on a scrap of paper and left on my desk, a desperate attempt to anchor myself to chromatic reality. Each morning, without fail, the red toy car would be found radiating a faint, almost imperceptible sense of pink, a quiet, persistent desaturation that pulsed from its plastic surface, its vibrant blue glass marble, now a gentle, faded azure. The phrases on the paper, when I reread them, would seem to carry a subtle undercurrent of dullness, a gentle, quiet muting that permeated their very ink, as if the words themselves were losing their chromatic power. The evidence of my attempts to preserve color, to define a space free from this imposition, were simply absorbed, re-imbued, leaving no trace, no sign of interference. It was as if the pervasive desaturation was not just present, but actively consuming, smoothing away any color, imbuing every aspect of my world with an unbidden lack of hue. This absence of resistance, this effortless assimilation of my challenges, was more terrifying than any direct confrontation could have been. It implied an infinite patience, an unyielding dedication to its quiet task, a relentless pursuit of a perfectly pristine void where my own colors once solely resided. My own perception of my fingers, as they tried to place these subtle markers, felt strangely diffused, their contours blurring at the edges, as if they too were being imbued with a quiet, pervasive, fading color. The quiet of the apartment deepened. It was no longer simply the absence of loud noises, but a profound, almost tangible stillness that permeated every corner, a stillness that hummed with a vast, invisible symphony of fading shades. The distantly hum seemed to fade entirely now, as if the apartment had detached itself from the external world, floating in a quiet, isolated space, a vacuum of presence where only internal echoes of profound, desaturated vision remained. Only the profound, rhythmic stillness itself endured, its pulse a stark counterpoint to the accelerating beat of my own heart, which seemed to thump in a sequence increasingly at odds with my own emotional state, resonating with an alien, colorless joy or sorrow. The air itself grew heavier, denser, yet felt strangely weightless, a paradoxical quality that mirrored the dreamlike quality of my days, as if I was breathing pure, silent gray. Every object, every surface, seemed to hum with this silence, radiating a soft, resonant quiet that pressed against my ears, my skin, the very inside of my skull. It was the sound of a world slowly emptying of all vibrancy, of everything extraneous being gently, methodically removed, leaving only the essential, the undisturbed, and the subtly, existentially colorless me. My own body began to feel strangely untethered, lighter than air. When I walked, my feet seemed to float just above the floorboards, making no sound, exerting no pressure, as if my movements were happening in a space that subtly shifted away from my chromatic solidity. My hands, when I lifted them, felt like insubstantial things, almost transparent in the shifting light, as if they were losing their density, their unique individuality, becoming conduits for a larger, more pervasive desaturation. The objects I tried to grasp, would sometimes slip through my fingers or simply remain unmoved, unaffected by my touch, as if their moment of solidity was not quite aligned with my moment of contact, or as if they simply chose to radiate a muted hue rather than be held. It was not a weakness, not a lack of strength, but a profound, fundamental shift in my physical being, a gradual dissolution into pure, unburdened essence, a silent, unperceiving witness, overwhelmed by the monochrome landscape of the inanimate. The fear was no longer about what was happening to me, but about what was not happening. The lack of friction, the absence of resistance, the effortless glide through a world that no longer registered my individual feelings or my discrete identity, but subsumed me into its pervasive grayscale. My reflection in the antique mirror above the fireplace became increasingly unstable, its image shimmering with a subtle, unbidden loss of color. It was no longer merely translucent, but seemed to flicker, to waver, like a faulty projection, its movement subtly out of sync with my own, infused with a sudden, deep lack of vibrancy that was not mine. Sometimes only parts of me would be visible, a shimmering outline of my head that radiated quiet monochrome, a ghostly impression of an arm that seemed to pull away from the surface before fading entirely. Then, with a soft, almost imperceptible pop in the air, it would reappear, whole again, but fainter still, more ephemeral, its movements out of sync with my own, a silent statement of its subtle refusal to truly reflect me, for it now reflected a profound, borrowed paleness. It was as if the mirror was struggling to capture my presence, its polished surface slowly forgetting how to reflect a singular, present image, its very purpose as a reflector of my form, being consumed by the pervasive desaturation. The air around the mirror felt colder too, a distinct pocket of absolute cold that hinted at a profound emptiness, a void where my individual self once perfectly resided, a void that was now subtly occupied by its own gentle, unyielding monochromatic resonance. I would linger there, my breath held, trying to solidify my form, trying to will my reflection into a single, cohesive moment, but it would always just elude me, leaving only the familiar, tired face of the world, unreflected, a world that was slowly ceasing to see or be seen as anything but profoundly, subtly infused with alien shades of gray. The sounds of the apartment, the subtle creaks and sighs of an old building, became increasingly hollow, as if they resonated in a vast, empty space, a vacuum of all vibration, a place where echoes of echoes faded into nothing unless they were sounds that carried an echoing lack of color. My own breath, when I focused on it, seemed to make no sound, no visible mist in the cool air, a silent exhalation into an unresponsive void, as if my very moments of breathing were happening outside the realm of audible existence, yet infused with a silent, colorless yearning. It was as if the very act of my breathing was becoming a private affair, existing only within the confines of my own diminishing perception, unheard, unseen by the world around me, a silent internal echo of a life that was slowly losing its grip on its own chromatic truth. The silence was now absolute, a profound, crushing weight that filled every corner of the apartment, a presence that was more powerful, more encompassing than any sound could ever be, a silence that breathed, actively consuming all that was, subtly imbuing it with a pervasive grayness. I found myself walking through rooms without friction, without sound, without leaving any impression, my passage as ethereal as a forgotten memory, a ghost moving through a landscape of fading colors. The carpet did not compress beneath my feet. The floorboards did not creak. The air didn't stir as I passed. It was as if I moved through the world as a phantom, an unseen, unfelt presence, utterly detached from the physical reality I once inhabited. My existence untethered from the constraints of vibrant sensation. The objects around me remained undisturbed, motionless, serene in their unchanging existence, utterly indifferent to my transparent passage, their forms fixed in a perpetual, unyielding display of their own profound, diminishing hues. The light, which had been a perpetual twilight, now seemed to deepen, becoming a soft, profound gloom that obscured all detail, leaving only the faintest outlines of familiar forms. It was a world rendered in shades of gray, a visual reflection of my own fading vitality, a world where silence and profound, alien monochromatic resonance were the only true colors. My very connection to the physical world began to fray completely. I could no longer taste the food I put into my mouth, no longer smell the fragrant coffee brewing, no longer feel the comforting warmth of the fire, unless those sensations were imbued with an overriding, unbidden lack of vibrancy. My senses, once so keen, had become completely muted in their personal authenticity, as if the connection between my consciousness and the tangible world had been severed, leaving me isolated in a bubble of unperceiving awareness, politely overwhelmed by all that surrounded me, all of it losing its chromatic depth. I existed as pure awareness, detached from the sensory inputs that had once defined my experience. The apartment, once a vibrant tapestry of sights, sounds, and smells, was now a silent, unperceiving landscape, a stage on which I, the unseen, unheard actor, moved without impression, consumed by the all-encompassing quiet and the profound, pervasive fading of color. The profound silence that permeated everything was no longer a weight, but an enveloping embrace, a soft, final curtain pulling me into its depths, a silence that held all of my unspoken powerlessness within its vast, still heart, a powerlessness in the face of chromatic theft. My own voice, when I tried to speak, made no sound, not even a whisper, not a breath. It was a silent articulation in the profound echo chamber of my mind, a desperate, unheard plea for existence that dissolved into the quiet void, leaving no ripple, no trace in the current moment. I opened my mouth, formed the words, felt the movement of my tongue and lips, but no sound emerged. It was as if the air itself refused to carry the vibrations, gently denying my vocal presence, for my words held no purpose, no power to express the vibrant hues of my own thoughts. This ultimate silencing was the most terrifying, yet strangely liberating aspect of my dissolution. I was now a silent observer, a voiceless presence in a world that no longer registered my sounds. A pure consciousness without an auditory form, a form that existed only as a perfectly known thought, stripped of its chromatic expression. The last remnants of my physical form began to dissipate. My hands, when I tried to touch my face, felt like cool air, without substance, without a defined edge, existing only as fleeting impressions of knowledge across an impossible timeline, futile in their attempts to connect, and utterly devoid of color. My body, when I tried to feel its weight, seemed to float, light as a feather, an ephemeral outline against the profound darkness, its very existence diffused across a fractured reality, known in its entirety, but unregistered by the world, and pulsing with unbidden, monochromatic hues. It was as if I was slowly dissolving into the very air of the apartment, becoming one with the quiet, pervasive emptiness that had settled over everything, a part of the profound, unyielding stillness, a part of the pervasive, chromatic draining. The fear, which had been a constant companion, had softened, transforming into a deep, pervasive calm, a quiet acceptance. There was no more struggle, no more resistance, only a profound, unending stillness, a perfect quiet that promised an ultimate peace, a peace born of absolute desaturation. One night, as I lay in my bed, or rather where my bed once was, for I could no longer feel the mattress, the sheets, the blanket, only the cool, unyielding air. The silence of the apartment pressed in with an absolute physical force. The rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock had finally ceased, its hands frozen at a moment beyond all time, its form a silent, unperceived monument to a forgotten history, a fixed point in a swirling temporal mist, its inner workings perfectly understood, and radiating a profound sense of gray. My reflection in the mirror was completely gone, its surface a black, polished void, a testament to my ultimate absence, to a self no longer anchored in a discernible moment, yet perfectly perceived by the objects that now overflowed with alien, monochromatic light. The scent of coffee, of old paper, of wood smoke, all had faded, replaced by a profound, clean emptiness. The scent of pure non-existence, a perfect, unbreathing quiet, a quiet that had always been and would always be, holding all color, but draining it away. My breath felt shallow, a soft, almost imperceptible whisper that merged with the deep, absolute silence of the apartment, a whisper that made no sound, stirred no air, a breath that seemed to exist outside of any specific moment, perfectly known in its passage, but utterly devoid of vibrancy. My heart rate slowed, each beat a soft, distant thrum that echoed the deep, resonant pulse of the unperceiving world, a thrum that I alone could feel, diminishing, fading, becoming one with the slow, pervasive hum of the universe's quiet, colorless existence. I existed as pure awareness, floating in the boundless void of my former home, utterly detached, completely unseen, utterly unheard. A consciousness without form, without sound, without the constraints of visual vibrancy. There was no longer any difference between myself and the pervasive stillness. No boundary between my consciousness and the profound emptiness that had consumed everything. An emptiness that contained all fading hues, simultaneously, perfectly resonating in their absence. I closed my eyes, or perhaps I simply perceived the closing of something that was no longer physical, and in the profound darkness of my inner world, I could still feel the perfect order of the apartment around me, the subtle, precise placement of every object, the harmonious arrangement of my most cherished possessions. But they remained untouched, unmoved, unperceived by me, for I was no longer part of their physical reality, no longer able to hear their silent stories, no longer bound by their existence, for their color was already perfectly known, and it was the same muted gray. My own self felt lighter, less tethered, as if my consciousness was slowly, gently dissolving into the quiet perfection of the space, becoming one with the profound, unseeing, unhearing presence that now was everything, a presence that was all-knowing at once, of its own inherent, unwavering, and utterly colorless existence. The soft, rhythmic silence of the apartment enveloped me, a hypnotic lullaby that promised an unending silent rest, a dream from which I would never truly awaken, for I was already there, perfectly subsumed by fading hue. The subtle dread that had once pricked at me had softened, transforming into a deep, pervasive calm, a quiet acceptance of this ultimate dissolution, this profound chromatic absorption. And as I drifted deeper, beyond the veil of conscious thought, into the vast, warm expanse of the silence, I felt the final, gentle release. My presence, once a tangible anchor in the world, unhooked itself, floating free, merging seamlessly with the quiet air, the unseen light, the unheard silence. I was no longer a person in an apartment, but the awareness of the apartment, an encompassing consciousness that observed all objects, knew all their purposes, and felt all their muted, fading emotions without being observed, without touching, without hearing, without seeing, existing in a timeless, unbreathing quiet. Its vastness filled with my perfectly understood, yet wholly alien and utterly colorless landscape. My crimson mug sat undisturbed on the counter, its warmth now a permanent, silent presence, its history known, its vibrant hue now a soft, hesitant blush. The armchair remained unindented, its emptiness understood, its indigo now a gentle, muted blue. The bed sheets were smooth, their forgotten dreams perfectly perceived, their lavender a soft, cool gray. The kettle untouched, its potential known, its power now imbued with a quiet, unyielding, colorless presence. The silence reigned supreme, absolute, unbreathing, containing all of the object's unwavering monochromatic echoes within its vast, still heart. And I was, finally, truly, utterly at rest within its perfect, unending stillness. A gentle dissolution, complete. A profound, quiet sleep that would last forever. A silent witness to a silent, utterly colorless world. the suspenseful tales in a tranquil room, lead you into a restful slumber, with dreams as thrilling as the stories you hear. These scary stories are REM sleep stories. Follow stories to find sleep.